All right, cool. Recording started. So welcome everybody. We have here Jeremy. Jeremy is an MD2 at University of Melbourne, an all-around good dude, and also the highest Section 1 scorer I've ever heard of. So Jeremy scored 82. And what's most impressive about that 82 is that, what did you get before? It was like 66 or something?
I got 60.
60?
Sorry,
Wild,
62. Yeah, 62.
62.
Sorry. Yeah.
So a 20-point increase. I've never heard, not only I've never heard 82, I've never heard of anyone even improving 10 points. So what a fantastic job. And what I loved about it as well when I hired Jeremy and we had a chat about it was that it was a conscious process. You didn't just fluke it the next time. And so the way that you went about improving at Section 1 was like I went about improving at Section 2 very deliberately, and it worked. And so I know we've got people obviously having gamsat coming up soon. And a lot of people haven't studied that much for Section 1 because obviously 2 and 3 is for a lot of people more high yield. So what I was hoping was that you could just share with us just in a very short period of time, whatever you think your main strategies that people, if they could just take 1 or 2 things into the gamsat and keep that in mind, that would help their performance. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for the intro and bigging me up a little bit there. But no, it definitely was a really conscious process for me because I think I had sat 4 gamsats until I got the 82 that I got, which got me this job and also got me into medicine. But for me, it was a kind of a lot of reflection, and that's kind of what I wanted to share. Just sort of a brief overview in the 5-10 minutes that we've got here is my sort of approach to Section 1. So I think one of the first things is that a lot of people kind of approach Section 1 like it's not really high yield, as you were saying, like they don't really believe that they can improve on it. And I think there's this kind of understanding that you need a lot of background knowledge, like you need to read very widely. And it's not so much that that's not helpful. In fact, there are a lot of courses out there that will kind of diversify your, diversify your knowledge and your understanding of a lot of these abstract concepts like neoliberalism and, Freudian psychology or, that sort of thing. All those things can be very, very helpful. But the key thing that helped me with Section 1 was understanding that at baseline, all the information you need is literally right in front of you. And so if they give you a passage from a novel, all you need to do is actually stay within that passage and understand that very, very well. And so I kind of think I've told sort of the 8 or 9 students I've taken over the summer that everyone has social skills. So that's the kind of way that I think about things, like what kind of stops you from interacting with people, with socializing. Say you're on a date with a really, really beautiful person and you're really, really nervous, is like that anxiety kind of acts as a cap, it kind of stops your social skills from coming out. And so I think about it as the same thing with Section 1. Everybody has an implicit ability to actually read and understand passages. And I've seen that even with a student of mine that was English as a second language, they're able to actually understand passages really, really well. The key sort of rate limiting steps are time pressure and the degree to which you're confident, I guess, the degree to which you can actually believe whether you can do that, and obviously a lot of practice. But I think as a first line sort of approach to Section 1, always believe that all the information you need is right in front of you. And that kind of leads on to sort of the second big broad Section 1 point that I have is always read the passage. Sorry, yeah.
So with I was chatting with Alina, who for everyone else is another 90+ Section 1 tutor, and she was saying about because how sometimes there's a question where it'll be like it'll ask the question and it'll have like 2 adjectives, like blah 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 is angry and sad or confused and tired or whatever, right? And what she was saying was about how you've got to not use your intuitive sense of the thing to justify an answer, but to literally have on line 2, that's where that is, and on line blah,
exactly.
So actually to find a thing. Is that what you mean by it's in the stem?
100%. Like that's actually, I was actually going to get to that in a second now,
okay.
but it's no, and it's amazing you brought it up now actually, because it's important to be evidence-based in everything that you're doing. So like kind of what I was saying about being on a date, like you've got the social skills and it's in your subconscious, but I tell all my students, elevate what's in the subconscious to your conscious, so that when you look at a question like this, if you have, angry and sad, you can consciously point out, okay, line 5 is where I get angry, line 6 is where I get sad. And that way, when you're doing the actual exam, a lot of people will come back to questions where they picked an answer based on intuition and they might actually be right. But because it was in their subconscious, it's all very muddled and vague, they kind of second guess themselves and end up going to another answer. And, a classic sort of MCQ thing that everyone struggles with, but particularly with Section 1, it seems, is that, you'll be able to eliminate 1 or 2 options very, very easily, and you'll be stuck between A and D or something like that. And then in that 50-50, you'll get it wrong because you you didn't bring it out of the subconscious into your conscious, into your conscious, excuse me. And when you do that, and you're very consciously aware of what you're doing, being evidence-based in this sense, it makes a huge difference, and you see a lot of scores will start to increase in that sense. But I think that's kind of leading on to what I was saying. What I was going to say with the second sort of big thing is do the passage first. Some people prefer with other sort of MCQ tests, and I'm not speaking to those. You know, they might prefer to do the questions first, you know, and try and zoom through the questions. But for me, I always try and look at the passages or the stems first and look at them from start to finish. And then that gives you context, because you kind of look at, say, line 5 in isolation. Line 5 might mean something, you know, when it's divorced from its context, it might mean something completely different. But if you understand it in its context, in terms of which character is saying it, or in terms of the broader contention of the author or the cartoonist or whatever it is in that particular stem, then you're better able to understand what that actually means. And then that will equip you to answer the questions, because I think a lot of questions will ask you not only what specific lines mean, but what do they mean in terms of the general understanding of what a general thrust of what the author is saying. So in terms of context, one sort of strategy I recommend is if it's pointing you to a specific line, you know, like question 6 will tell you, look at line 20. You know, what does the character mean when they say this? I'll look at that line, and if I can't find the answer within that line, I look above that line and below that line. If it mentions a particular theme or a particular word, like, I don't know, escargot or something, like, I don't know, something weird, I'll yeah, I couldn't think of anything off the top of my head, but, you know, escargot, you cross-reference that and you look for another part of the stem that has mentioned that. And so little things like that, you know, looking above and below to give you the immediate context, and then cross-referencing to where the other theme, to where the theme or the word has been mentioned before. Things like that are using your understanding of context to really answer the questions in the way that they're designed to be answered. And that leads me on to a bit more of a specific point when it comes to passages, because passages or prose, you'll often see a lot of other companies refer to it as prose. They're a very, very common theme in the gamsat, and they seem to be more and more emphasized in the current generation of gamsats. The one thing that really helped me was thinking about prose and passages as if they're like a journey. Okay, so you know, a journey that you're being taken on by the author from, say, point A to point F, okay, for example. And if you think about that journey, you know, you're not really going to be heading in a straight direction. You might take a left turn here, you might take a right turn, you might miss a turn and do a UE or something like that, you know? And so you kind of follow that trajectory, and it's helpful to understand that journey, not just in terms of point A to point F, but point B, C, D, and E as well. And every sort of little turn along that journey that leads you to that point. Because
clarify, so I just want to understand a little bit more specifically a couple of things. One, so I've understood about what you're meaning about obviously, understand something in its context, right? Sure.
Yeah.
And it's a journey. But how specifically can I, if I'm sitting in the gamsat or can how a student, what specifically can they do to better understand the context? Like, so for example, what I had done in the past was I visually write out, like, let's say it says there's 2 artists, and I'll do a line and the artist 1 says this, artist 2 says this, to visually map out the relationships. I personally found that helped me understand the context better.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific recommendations about how to better understand context, or other than just 2?
Yeah. I think sometimes, you know, writing things out can be very helpful, although you have to balance that out with the time constraint as well. So that's something that I tell my students. If you're really, really, it's a sort of case by case thing. Like if you're on a stem where you're really, really stuck, start writing it out. If it helps you, write a sort of dot point summary of it to help you understand the context. But one big thing that a lot of people will miss is actually the pre stem. So you notice that right underneath, say, unit 4, it'll give you a little bit of context, like, oh, this is a passage about a 1979 event or something like that, and then that gives you a bit of context. And the key thing is that I've noticed that when people read from start to finish, they actually read deeply, you know, they don't just like skim read, but you're actually reading to understand. That isn't really a waste of time. It's a bit of a balancing act when you're reading to understand, because some students will tend to like read too deeply, and then suddenly 5 minutes have gone by, they haven't started the questions. So there's definitely that kind of balancing act there that you just have to work on. But as a general rule, I say reading to understand is not a waste of time. And if you really, really understand what's being said, that equips you to answer the questions in the way that they're designed to be answered. And that's kind of what I was saying with passages. Like if you read from sort of point A to point D and you understand every turn along that point A to point F, sorry, I'm just cut the journey short there. But if you kind of follow every turn along that journey, it actually puts you in the right frame of mind to answer the question, because a lot of people will find that the questions are designed like question 1 will ask you about paragraph 1. Question 2 will ask you maybe about the second half of paragraph 1. Question 3 will ask you about paragraph 2. And there's a general sequential order in terms of how the question, it's almost like it's taking you through that journey. And you kind of look at the questions that way as well, but also understand that the author, the person who wrote the passage, has a particular intention and they're presenting information in a particular order for a reason. It's not just like A is here, B is here, C is here, D is here. But a really stupid analogy I use, but my students, it sticks in my students' head, is that, you know, imagine you meet me for the first time and you think, oh, you know, this guy's an all right guy. And then 3 weeks later, you hear that I ran over my cat, right? So it'd be like, with that particular not that I've ever done that, but like with that particular context, you'd be like, oh, Jeremy's a bit of an idiot, but he's a nice guy. You know, you probably didn't mean anything by it. Now flip that on its head and say the first thing you ever hear about me is I ran over my cat, right? It's like the hell's wrong with this guy? And then it takes a lot more work for me to actually gain your respect again. And so that's a really stupid analogy, but it's to emphasize the idea that the order in which information is presented is actually quite important. And so if you read things from start to finish, you're kind of following what the author's trying to do there. And that's what the questions are going to be asking you. The questions are going to be asking you, what does the author mean by this, right? What is the character's intention behind saying this?
Like, sorry to cut you off. What it sounds
Yeah.
like you're saying is that there's some kind of like almost a contention that the author has, or an intention. Are you saying that deliberately trying to pick out what the contention of this point is? Yep,
absolutely. I think I think that's actually literally what I've written down in my notes is contention, or at least intention. It's funny that you said that. But yeah, no, there's definitely sort of a message. Like I try to tell my students, always have a global impression of what you're reading as well. Like if it's an article about Freudian psychology, are they approving of it? Are they disapproving of it? Are they making a comment on one particular part of it? Like what's the general thrust of it? And then you kind of always keep that in the back of your mind as you're reading it, because that actually acts as like an anchor point for you. Because sometimes you might read a sentence, you might kind of digress, or, you know, we always put our own biases on things. But tying back to what I was saying before, you know, is like, if you stay within the passage, if you trust that all the information you need is right in front of you, you can't go wrong with that. You're in the best position to answer the questions that are put in front of you. That's sort of passages and prose. And with cartoons as well, it's actually very similar. Like you think about the context in which cartoons might usually... Yeah, no. Cartoons are very, very subjective. And so that's like the whole issue is that when we, like, if you give me a cartoon about Asian parenting, like I'd have 1,000,001 things to say about that. Yeah. But like, that's obviously, you know, my bias is coming in, right? But you think about the context in which cartoons might appear is you might see them in newspapers, you might see them in magazines, that sort of thing. Generally speaking, if they appear in that setting, they want to appeal to a wide audience, and they have a very limited frame to do that in. Like you might get like 1 or 2 panels in a cartoon, and people are just going to look at it like while they're looking through the news, and you need to be able to convey some kind of deep message about society or some kind of humorous comment in a very, very short amount of time. And so when you understand that literally everything in the cartoon has been put there for a reason, right? The cartoonist has an intention, if not a contention. So try to pick up the central message of what the cartoon is saying, what the global impression is. Is it a comment about euthanasia? Is it a comment about urbanization? Something like that, you know, whatever it's broadly trying to say. Is it pro, against, whatever? Is it exaggerating? There was one cartoon that I saw, which was like a sort of an exaggeration of the sort of classical trope in marriages, which is that the man is emotionally unavailable and the woman just wants to communicate. And it's a very exaggerated sort of play on that. But that was sort of the message of the cartoon, is that it's just a humorous take, an exaggeration or a hyperbole of that very typical scenario. And once again, when you have that central message in mind, it acts as an anchor point, because some people might see a picture on the wall in the cartoon and think like, oh, why is there a dinosaur there? What does that have to do with the central message? It's like, well, the author's got to fill up the space somehow. I'm sorry, the cartoonist's got to fill up the space somehow. Maybe he's just painting the scene a little bit. But I've noticed that most students will be able to pick up the sort of central message within like 20, 30 seconds. Like you just look at the cartoon, you're just kind of like, okay, I think I get what this is saying. And again, what stops them from articulating it is confidence. Or in some cases, you just kind of miss it, or you're focusing on details that are not really, really relevant. But
I'll cut you off. I just want to clarify, make sure there's threats are taken care of. Firstly, there's so when you say that most people, it's in your subconscious, you've got to make it conscious. The first time you said that you've got to find something specifically to ground that intuition in. But then the second time now you're saying about how it needs to be that you can pick it up, but you kind of just need to trust yourself. So how, I guess, because I've found myself in section 1 stems before where I've got a feeling about something. And then when Alina had that conversation and she was like, oh, you got to ground it in evidence. I was like, well, maybe that means I've got to not trust my feelings. How do I balance? There's been both of these messages kind of in what we've been talking about so far. How do you balance it? And which one do you go with?
Yeah, good question. So I think in terms of your intuition, like your intuition can come from a lot of different places. That's how I think about it. Is like, again, with Asian parenting, like I've got my own feelings about this, but the passage is trying to say something else, right? The author has a particular view that they're trying to say. In that case, you kind of ground it. When it comes to sort of cartoons, like this is where intuition gets a bit tricky, because you pick up on a lot of things, if you notice, like in your environment without even realizing it, right? Like you might notice that the car that just went past is red. And so even though your intuition might have a bit of bias mixed into it, it might also have some accurate facts. And that's why when you kind of use your intuition, it's not so much you're denying your intuition, but you're challenging it with the evidence. And so you're seeing which parts of it are like, okay, so I see that, this lady in the cartoon is sobbing, therefore she must be sad, right? It's like, that's fair. That's a fair assumption. Yeah. I can see that there's a guy there with a lab coat and a stethoscope. It's fair to assume that he's a doctor. Is the doctor slapping the patient across the face? No, because I don't see the doctor going, in the cartoon, that kind of thing, right? So I think that's sort of, it sounds like a bit of a woo kind of answer, but
hold on, two questions then. So one, okay, so you have a global impression, or like you said that about the pros, or you have an intuition, which is your subconscious. Then you go and try and find evidence in, the detailed use of words, detailed style, or in the cartoon, a picture on a wall or something like that. What if the evidence that I might be answering my own question, but what if the evidence that you find doesn't support the intuition that you had? I guess you just go with the evidence and leave your intuition.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's probably best. And when you're being very, very evidence-based, like the facts will speak for themselves, I think. Like there might be some times that I'm reading a passage, I'll be like, oh, I got that completely wrong, because I'll reread that. I'll be like, oh, hang on, that's actually what it's saying here. And when you've kind of read the whole thing, like there are certain, when it comes to evidence, I suppose, like we usually like to think of specific lines, but there are specific lines that you can kind of misunderstand. And so that's why it's important to have the global impression, because again, that's your anchor. Because if there's a line that you've misunderstood wildly and it disagrees with the general thrust, like you understand every other line perfectly fine, and you understand this is vaguely what the author's saying.
So are you saying that you should test every line against your global impression, or just the lines that you don't understand?
It's hard to do that if you haven't read the passage at all, right? So you got to read the passage first and be like, okay, what am I getting? And I kind of tell my students, you got to be prepared when you're going into section 1 to not be able to understand every passage perfectly well. That's the key thing, is like I try and get to about, say, the very, very rough, like I'm not trying to, I don't have any specific measure for what this actually looks like, but approximately a 50% understanding of the passage, because the questions will help you fill in the rest. So the questions will focus your attention to like, oh, this particular line by this particular character, whatever it is. And then you start understanding it a bit more deeply. Like by the end of reading the passage alone, I've understood 50, 60% of it. By the end of the questions, I've understood 95% of it, because the questions help you fill in those gaps.
Do you find yourself So I've got another student coming in 3 minutes, which is a shame.
Yeah, all good, all
So
good.
much
No.
Maybe we'll do another video another time.
No, that's all good, it's all good. Happy to help.
Do you find yourself agonizing over? Sometimes I find in section 1, I agonize. Is it this or is it this? And it's almost like this internal battle, and I feel like so conflicted. What do you do?
Absolutely.
Like, what do you do there? Is it just going back
Yeah.
to trying to find evidence to justify, or do you find a pattern of you're wrong when you change it, or is this just looking too far into?
No. I it's a good question, because I think, again, not to beat a dead horse, but I think Alina was spot on with this. You know, like the evidence will speak for itself. Like you actually find that when you've practiced enough and you read a particular line, sometimes there are different types of interpretations. So quickly, I can think of just one off the top of my head. There was a question which talked about the French Revolution. And it was a quote from like one of the fathers of the French Revolution about, hurrying people to the scaffold, right? Because they wanted justice as opposed to corruption. And scaffold in the olden times could mean basically meant like a guillotine, or like where they hang a noose. It's equated to like capital punishment, right? Or you could think about scaffolding as like the kind of scaffolding you see around a building, right? So there are two kind of interpretations there, and either one might seem plausible, but actually the justice one seems the most accurate, simply because of everything I've said in terms of understanding the context, right? And so you'd go with that one because the passage, you're taking my word for it, but the passage was about justice. And so it makes more sense that scaffolding here would refer to the capital punishment, kind of the execution kind of scaffolding.
More evidence for. So maybe
that's right. Yeah.
Balancing it. Okay.
Yeah. And I think this is where I actually wanted to quickly close with this, is I can give you a lot of strategies which sound quite abstract, but when you start doing the questions, you'll start to feel like that actually makes a lot of sense. And this is not just because I did it, but because a lot of my students have found that when you actually do this and you're actually conscious about how you're doing it, it doesn't feel as bad. In fact, I wouldn't go this far, but some of them said, I actually enjoy doing section 1. And I'm just like, cool, maybe you'll have my job one day, but but no, I guess as a final sort of encouragement to the students, just quickly, is I think this is definitely something that is not a write-off. Like section 1 is something that you definitely can improve on if you're conscious of it and you're reflective about it and you apply some of these strategies. I think you're gold. Yeah.
God, I love you. Thank you so much. I have to go teach now, but I'm going to get this uploaded. I'll share it with the students. Maybe another time we can do some, we can come and do some DES and actually just look at some stems and apply some of those principles. But
yeah, sounds good.
Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you in hospital.
Man.
And thanks. All right, man.
Thanks, man. See you later.
Catch up.